أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين أما بعد. Today I want to talk about forced marriages and also the age of marriage. Now these are two contentious issues in the Muslim world, incidentally and ironically, because they should not be contentious issues at all, but they are. So I'm going to discuss that here. So first, we need to ascertain whether either of these are allowed in Islam. So of course, categorically, I'm going to say no, they are not allowed by virtue of the Qur'an itself. But I will point that out and highlight those facts today, so that inshallah, after you are done listening to this talk, there can be no doubt that these are not allowed. Now, I know we often say, for example, that forced marriages are not allowed in principle. But culturally, in the Arab world and in the Pakistan, they still do practice forced marriages by making the marriage about the arrangement. And if the girl turns down the arrangement, then she's shaming the family and the father. You know, obviously the fathers have such big egos that, she's going against her father. And they will emphasize the Islamic perspective that one must obey one's parents. And they never add the caveat that one must obey one's parents when one's parents are not going against Allah and the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And there is no obedience in disobedience to Allah and the Messenger of Allah. And this is the point that we never emphasize. We just emphasize in these cultures obedience to the parents and saving the father's ego, which we call his honor. So let us dive in, and inshallah these things will, with time, the Muslims will go back to Islam. Amen. Okay. So firstly, we look at the Qur'an. Okay. Now, what we often do is we quote the verse about obedience to parents, verse 19 of chapter 4, which says that, "O you who have believed, it is not lawful for you..." That's not the verse I wanted to start with. The verse we quote from chapter 17, verse 23, which says, and your Lord has decreed that you worship none except him, and to parents good treatment, whether one or both of them reach old age. While with you, say not to them so much as uff, and do not repel them, but speak to them a noble word. So because Islam encourages this very, very good treatment of parents, and generally that children must obey their parents, we tend to want to see this as absolute. But what we tend to ignore often is that obedience in Islam is never to anyone other than God, is never absolute. Okay, because only God is the absolute, and all obedience must be in obedience to God and the Messenger of God. Now, we also see that the Quran tells us that whoever has obeyed the Messenger has obeyed God. So this is not separate. Okay, obeying the Messenger of God is to obey God. So when we just say that obeying God is absolute, it implies also, of course, then obedience to the messenger of God. Okay, so that's in brief. So let us continue. So we interpret the verse from chapter 17, verse 23 to mean obedience, absolute obedience to your parents or to authorities, and that is not the case. Okay, so let us continue. And we can see many evidences of that. For example, where the Qur'an says that obey Allah and His Messenger and those in authority amongst you, but if there is any dispute, then refer back to Allah and His Messenger. So it shows you that those in authority amongst you, outside of Allah and His Messenger, is a limited authority, okay, which can fall into question where needed. Okay, so let us continue. And we see that where we can establish that the Quran does not allow women to be forcefully wedded is where it says in chapter 4, verse 19, O you who have believed, it is not lawful for you to inherit women by compulsion, and do not make difficulties for them in order to take back part of what you gave them, unless they commit a clear immorality, and live with them in kindness. For if you dislike them, perhaps you dislike a thing, and Allah makes therein much good. So from this verse, it is clear that we are not allowed to inherit women against their will, meaning there's no force. Now, there was a practice in pre-Islamic Arabia, and still to today we find the practice prevalent in Arabia, where when a man dies and he leaves behind a wife, then the wife is inherited by his brother. His brother has to marry his wife. We saw that happen. It's a common custom in Arabia, from Lebanon to Syria to the Gulf regions. This is a common practice. And then it's established as a custom, and then the woman can't object to this. And so the Quran is saying that you cannot force the woman to be inherited against her will by compulsion. Okay. So now the next issue is, so the forced marriages, okay, out of the question. Next question is the age of consent, the age of marriage. Okay. So here you see that, firstly, if you cannot inherit women by compulsion against their will, then at what age do we consider people to have consent, the age of consent? Do you understand the question? Because you can force children, your young children, to do as you say, right? Because they don't have consent. We have this is a common legal construct throughout the world. For example, if your child wants to go on a trip, and then they will send the child home with a form, the parent has to fill out the form to give consent. Okay, because the parent is responsible for the child, so the parent needs to consent. At which age is it, this is the question, legally, that the child now has the right to consent? Now, in most countries, that's 18. Okay? Now, because the Quran is universal and must be applied throughout the ages, of course, it doesn't tell you the age of consent, but it gives you an indication that there must be consent. So if there must be consent, it cannot be consented. The consent cannot come from someone who is not by the mental capacity to consent. So what you have is, for example, if you must ask yourself if a child can consent to buying a car with your money, you would not allow that. Can a child consent to traveling overseas alone? You would not allow that. If a child cannot consent to those things, how can a child consent to marriage? Okay, so this is not me trying to stretch the logic of the Quran. This is kind of obvious, because the verse says, again I go back to the verse, it is not lawful for you to inherit woman by compulsion, meaning they must consent, right? So at which age can they consent? Okay, this would strongly imply that they have to be lawful adults to consent, which means that a child cannot consent to marriage. Okay, a child cannot consent to marriage. You wouldn't let your child buy a car with your money. You wouldn't let a child travel overseas alone. How could you let a child get married? You wouldn't allow your child to consent to marriage because it is untenable, right? So in the custom where people practice arranged marriages for their children, it is known that when those children become adults, they have to consent to being married to each other. What is adulthood in terms of the Qur'an? So we go again to chapter 4, okay, verse 2, which says, "And give to the orphans their properties, and do not substitute the defective of your own for the good of theirs. And do not consume their properties into your own. Indeed, that is a great sin." And then we go to verse 6. So we skip over the verse that talks about polygyny and the verse thereafter, and we go to verse 6, and it says, verse 6 tells us, "And test the orphans in their abilities until they reach the age of marriage." So here we have a scenario where the guardian looks after the property of the orphan, and then they reach a certain age, which the Qur'an says, the age of marriage, right? Then, if you perceive in them sound judgment, release their property to them. So what does that mean? The Qur'an is telling us that there is an age of marriage. Okay, now we may not like that it's telling us there is an age of marriage, because some people want to marry underage girls, but the Qur'an is telling you that there is an age of marriage. That's what it's literally saying. And the thing I need to point out, and let me go to it, is that the age of marriage coincides with being able to manage wealth. How do we know that? Because it says, "And test the orphans until they reach the age of marriage. Then if you perceive in them sound judgment, release their property to them." So what do you need? You need the age of marriage, and you need them to have sound judgment to release the property to them. And do not consume it excessively and quickly, anticipating that they will grow up. So it can make it even more clear. Basically, when you've decided that this orphan is now a responsible adult, then you give them their money. And you don't spend it in a hurry, right? Because you don't want to have to give it back to them, so you want to quickly spend it before they grow up. Do you understand? So it's clear. "And whoever, when acting as guardian, is self-sufficient, should refrain from taking a fee." So if you are independently wealthy and you're raising this orphan, you have your own money, you shouldn't even touch their money. Okay? "And whoever is poor, let him take according to what is acceptable." But if you're poor, then you're only going to take as much as is needed to sustain this orphan. You're not going to use the money to try to use it up on yourself. "Then when you release their property to them, bring witnesses upon them, and sufficient is Allah as accountant." So here you can see the orphan, and this is referring to the woman. This is the chapter of the woman, okay? So here you can see there is an age of marriage. That's the first thing that comes out. You can see that this age of marriage is coupled with, okay, sound judgment, and that the orphan will receive their property at that time. So this is important, okay? So I'm going to also just show you that we are talking about something which we call, let me see where it is. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وَبَتَلُوا الْيَتَامَى حَتَّى إِذَا بَلَغُوا النِّكَاحِ. Okay, now بَلَغُوا النِّكَاح, we translate reach a marriageable age, but we know what baligh is, right? When they've reached the marriageable age with puberty, meaning they have now, the girl menstruates, right? But now we can ask ourselves, is that enough, yani? Is it enough that, okay, so is the marriageable age that she bleeds? She has reached the puberty, so now she can marry. Now, of course, for most of human history, that has been the technical definition, because obviously it is the sign that the woman is now capable of bearing children. But we see that there is not only the issue of being baligh, of reaching the age of menstruation, but also aqil, which is a common construct in fiqh, incidentally, because it says here, فَإِنْ آنَسْتُم مِّنْهُمْ رُشْدًا فَدَفَعُوا إِلَيْهِمْ أَمْوَالَهُم. Okay, so if you perceive in them that they are able to make wise decisions with their money, then you release their money to them. Okay, so I just wanted to point out that in Arabic so that you can see this is what we're talking about. Balaghun nikah. Okay, so we will continue. So is there an age of marriage in the Qur'an? Yes, there is. What is the age of marriage? The age is balaghun nikah, baligh wa aqil, and the ability to make fair assessments regarding wealth. Now, the fair assessments regarding wealth doesn't happen with a kid. Let me just say that, okay? Even if she, let's say, for example, there's a child, there's a girl, and she becomes she's a mukallafa, like she has a period at 9 years old, and now that means she can get married. Does it mean that? Right? So no, it does not mean that, unless, of course, she's also one of those very, very mature girls who goes and do the shopping, the grocery shopping, and can manage money and handle the affairs of money. And most 9-year-olds can't do that. Okay? So there's a level of maturity spoken about here. Okay? And so this is not and therefore there's no age specifically mentioned, because some women might mature very quickly. There might be girls as young as 13, 14, 15 who have grown up in a way where they can take care of everything, where they can manage the money and the household and the finances, and they are mature physically, their bodies are mature enough to have sex. And then there are women who take much longer, and that's why there is the guardian that needs to sign off on this. In other words, to decide now, has this person reached the age of discernment? And this is a guardian thing, okay? But to do so before that would be criminal, and that is what I'm saying. And so we cannot obviously marry women who are under age. And that's the evidence of that. So now, does that contradict with certain narrations? Yes, it does. It contradicts with a narration which says that Aisha radiallahu anha was 6 years old when there was the Aqdun Nikah, and 9 years old when the Aqdun Nikah became Nikah, okay? When they consummated the marriage with the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It contradicts it because biologically a 6-year-old, first of all, cannot consent to marriage, okay? Because you need to reach the age of consent, as we established. And if it's an arranged marriage and that the person is going now to consent later, decide later on, which needs to happen, then 9 years old is not likely to be an age of maturity in any era that we now live in. So it is better to cast aspersions on a narration, one narration, because a narration, questioning a narration or a hadith doesn't take you out of the fold of Islam. Okay? But going against the Qur'an deliberately and ignoring it is another story altogether, especially when the matter becomes clear. So we find that you cannot marry, basically, children. You cannot marry children in Islam. Now, can you have an arrangement for marriage between children? Yes, you can. But once they reach the age of adulthood, now that the marriage must now be consummated, they can decide whether they want to go ahead with that contract or not. Okay, because the consent needs to... There's another thing also about consent which I need to point out, okay? And that is, in Islam, rape is not allowed. You cannot rape a woman, like even if she's your wife. And because marriage is literally the act of having sex is what marriage is, were you to take a woman against her will, meaning without consent, then the act of sleeping her will be rape. That's another problem. And that is, unfortunately, where we also tend to go astray with this issue of consent and rape also. Okay. So I think I will continue. Let me continue. Okay, and also just debunk this issue of wealth. Okay, wealth, because we tend to have a conception in modern Islam where we think that a man can only get married if he's wealthy, because maintenance is on him, and to maintain a wife and children does take considerable amount of wealth, and hence he can only marry when he's wealthy. And while that may seem logical, and while that is one construct of marriage and isn't false, there are several constructs of marriage. So I want to point that out. The Qur'an is a bit more nuanced than Christianity in that way, okay? Because that's like a very Christian construct of marriage. Breadwinner, homemaker. End of story, black and white. The Qur'an doesn't have that black and white, okay? It's black and white in terms of that it's clear, but it doesn't say there's only one style, okay? And that I want to point out, because we have all these rock star preachers, these simp imams that like to preach women's rights, and the woman has the right to maintenance, and we're not bemoaning that, but we never preach women's duties. So the woman thinks she has the right to maintenance. She can sit at home and do nothing, because he needs to also provide her with a servant and provide her with all the creature comforts, and she's just going to be bored out of her mind, and that doesn't work. Okay, marriage doesn't work when it's done like that. So they preach an ideal that is not ideal, and then they say no, it's from Islam, when it's not from Islam, and we'll see that shortly. So we see that Allah advises that the believers marry, okay? It is not ideal within a believing society for there to be many single men and women. Rather, it is better that people who are able to marry get married, and to even forsake material demands in the interest of society and the chastity of the believers. So we see in chapter 24, verse 32, Allah says, marry off the single among you, and those of your male and female slaves who are fit for marriage. If they are poor, God will provide for them from His bounty. God's bounty is infinite, and He is all-knowing. Okay, let's see here. So we see now that it says if they are poor. So you can see marriage is not only for rich people, and it says if they are poor, then Allah will provide them from His bounty. So, in other words, it's saying that look, prioritize marriage. Even if people are poor, still prioritize marriage, even for poor people, rather than have a situation where people don't get married, as it is currently in the Middle East. About 70% of people of marriageable age are not married because they prioritize wealth and not marriage, right? Everybody wants to get rich from marriage for some reason. Okay. So we see here in the next verse it says, you will not be blamed if you divorce women when you have not yet consummated the marriage or fixed a bride gift for them, but make fair provision for them, the rich according to his means and the poor according to his. This is a duty for those who do good. So here you can see again Allah is telling us the rich according to his means and the poor according to his. So if the man is poor, then he does his best. If the man is rich, he does his best. It's not about who has the most money. Okay? And here also it's telling us that you can actually divorce a woman after contracting a marriage and having not consummated it. Okay? So if you divorce wives before consummating the marriage, but after fixing a bride gift for them, then give half of what you had previously fixed. This is the verse is telling us. Unless they waive their right, or unless the one who holds the marriage tie waives his right. Waiving your right is nearer to godliness, so do not forget to be generous towards one another. God sees what you do. So here God is calling on the woman to be generous with her wealth that He has gifted her. That like the mahar, right? So you can see that the narrative we establish is that money sort of flows one way, from the man to the woman. Okay? But the Qur'an doesn't talk like that in many instances, and I will show you. Okay? Oh, you who believed, when you marry believing women and then divorce them before you have touched them, then there is not for you any waiting period to count concerning them. So provide for them and give them a gracious release. Okay. So let us continue. And I don't want to go into too much detail, and I don't also want to make this too long. But anyway, to sum up, guys, to sum it up, that you cannot force women to marry against their will. You cannot coerce them, you cannot force them. The ways in which women are forced to marry still in Muslim societies today is because it will be shameful for them to go against their fathers, so then they are coerced. Or because they need the permission of the guardian to marry, so what you simply do as a father is you just refuse. So let's say, for example, my daughter wants to marry a guy, I don't like him, so I refuse. So she cannot marry him against my will because I'm the guardian, right? Then I say, look, I'm not preventing you from marrying. I just don't want you to marry that guy. She says, okay, fair enough. We find another guy, okay. I have a problem with the next guy. Fair enough. We find another guy. I have a problem with the next guy. Finally, she's forced to marry the guy I choose because every guy that she ever wanted, well, I had a problem with. So this is me forcing her to marry the person that I wanted to marry, because I will refuse any person that she might want to marry until she agrees to the person, her first cousin maybe, that I chose, because it's my culture, right? So that is one way of forcing. So we cannot force them to marry. And then the other way we force things is, there is a prophetic narration, a hadith, that says if a woman refuses to have sex with her husband, then the angels will curse her for that night. So this is obviously established as a rule to prohibit women from weaponizing sex, because it's a conjugal right. It's called a right for a reason, okay? Now, unfortunately, this is used as a means to have the woman surrender herself in the beginning of marriage, meaning, now she didn't really consent to this guy that she's marrying. Now she must let the man rape her, in other words, because otherwise the angels will curse her. Now this is a misuse and misapplication altogether, because nowhere, even in the narration, if we consider it authentic, because I don't know, I'm not an expert in the sciences of hadith, but nowhere in the narration is it saying that the man can rape his wife. It's not saying that. It's saying the angel will curse her if she refuses, meaning she can refuse, and then the angels will curse her. Nowhere is it saying that he must rape her or force her. So there is no such thing as marital rape. In a sense, it's a kind of an oxymoron, because a woman is not supposed to resist. But if a woman was forcefully married off, that means, in fact, that she didn't consent. So, first of all, the actul nikah is unlawful because she didn't consent, and the man is not actually allowed to sleep with her. Now, when he does sleep with her, that means he's raping her. That's what it means. And or if she finally does, if she does happen to surrender, meaning he marries, okay, this can happen also. This is a possibility, right? So the woman is arranged in a marriage and she marries and she didn't consent. She was given in marriage. She didn't consent. But now she is alone with a guy. He's a decent guy. He doesn't immediately approach her for sex. And she kind of likes him, and she likes him. She gets to like him. She gets to know him. She feels comfortable with him, and she wants to sleep with him. Now, that's different. So now if he sleeps with her, that makes it lawful, because now she has consented. It doesn't matter whether her consent was later on witnessed or not. Okay? Because the actual marriage is actually between the two people who are getting married, the man and the woman. So in this case, that's fine. Okay? Sometimes that does happen. But ideally, this is not how things should be done. Okay? Because you cannot force people into marriages they don't want to be in. And that is a very big oppression on people, and men and women, because boys are also forced into marrying people they don't want. Okay? So that's the ways in which people are forced, and we need to stop with all the forcing. And we ask Allah to grant us hidayah, and Allah to grant us tawfiq, so that we can return to Islam.